Please welcome Carnegie Mellon University's 10th president, Dr. Farnam Jahanian.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Before I start, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge last night's tragedy in Washington, D.C. The loss of life is truly devastating, and our thoughts go out to the many loved ones who are left to live in a heartbreak today. I want to ask all of you, please join me in a moment of silence to mourn those who perished last night, and of course pray for the families whose lives have been forever impacted by this tragedy. Thank you. Now I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished speaker for this President's Lecture Series event, esteemed author and journalist David Ignatius. You can clap if you want. Great. As you will hear in just a few moments, David is no stranger to Pittsburgh, having reported on the U.S. steel industry from our fair city many years ago. David, we're glad you're here. Also with us today are members of our Carnegie Mellon's Board of Trustees and members of our campus community, including our faculty, staff, and students. I want to thank also members of the Pittsburgh community, including some of our public and private sector leaders, for joining us. Thank you all for being here. Today, there's no question that politics in America and around the world, particularly in the time of transition, offers us plenty of opportunities to connect, add our own perspectives, ask questions, and of course, in an environment like this, learn from each other. In fact, we at CMU are very intentional about building bridges of understanding and engaging in civil discourse, especially when emotions are high and topics are complex. And this is precisely why today's event is also part of our Deeper Conversation series. As all of you know, we launched this last year, and earlier this fall, our Deeper Conversation series programming focused on navigating issues related to democracy and the election. And in the coming months, we will broaden this theme to inspire through thoughtful conversations about the role of government in society. David Ignatius and I were at an event last summer, and I had an opportunity to talk to him about the upcoming election and also the current geopolitical climate. And at that point, I invited him to join us for a campus conversation. Of course, back then, we didn't know how the election would turn out, but it was clear to me that no matter what the end result was going to be, David would have great insights and perspectives to offer to our campus community. Of course, we had the election in November and the inauguration last week, and here we are 10 days into President Trump's second term. Let me take a couple of moments to say a few words about our speaker. David is a man of many talents. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, a best-selling novelist, and an expert on foreign affairs and national security. And over a career that spans more than 4 decades, David has occupied a front-row seat to some of the foreign policy's biggest moments. In 2003, he was embedded a journalist covering the Iraq War. He was also in the streets of Cairo as the crowd celebrated the overthrow of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak during the rise of Arab Spring. And he's conducted countless interviews on record, off records, with elected officials, members of Congress, and the list goes on. Today, David has the daunting task of sharing his perspective with the world for the Washington Post, where he serves as associate editor and columnist. The list of awards that David has earned is too many to enumerate, but I want to tell you one piece of information that's important. that in the earliest chapter of his career and in a pivotal moment in our city's history, David was a Pittsburgher and he lived here for a couple of years during the 1970s, and he's going to tell us more about that. Reflecting on that time, David wrote, and I quote, "Pittsburgh is one of those places that never entirely leaves you, even when you go away." Well, David, I couldn't agree more. We're so glad you're here back with us. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to David Ignatius. David.
So thank you to Farnham for the introduction. I'll speak a little bit about Pittsburgh, but I really should say something, as Farnham did, about the loss of life in Washington. I was supposed to fly from Reagan National Airport this morning and learned on the way to the airport that the airport was closed. Thanks to a wonderful scramble by one of Farnham's associates, Pam, we managed to rebook my flight to Dulles Airport, and I was able to get here. But it is one of those tragedies that just makes you think what a thin thread we hang on with our sublime systems that can fail in a minute. We don't know how it happened, but it is a cause for reflection. I should just correct one thing that Farnham said. I always believe that journalists have to be accurate above all. I was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, much as I would like to claim to have won one. You may notice, if you're sitting up close, that I'm wearing a button that says "I love robots." And so I'm kind of a walking, advertisement for CMU. I've had the most amazing day. I've seen so many different parts of the campus, so many different programs. My wife has a doctorate in computer science, and she is going to be so envious when I get home and I tell her all the things that I learned today. So, as Farnham says, I began my career here. I came to Pittsburgh in 1976. And I just want to tell you about the person who arrived here. I had gone to a boys' private school in Washington called St. Albans, wonderful school. One of my classmates was Al Gore. I'd gone to Harvard. I was lucky enough to get into Harvard. I won a fellowship from Harvard to study at Cambridge and was at King's College. So I had had just about every special opportunity that a student can have. And I decided, because I'd been studying economics and I knew I wasn't a very good economist, that I wanted to be a journalist. So I applied to the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal said, "We have an opening in Pittsburgh covering the Steelworkers Union." Now, if there was a less likely person in America to cover the biggest industrial union in the country than Mr. Preppy, Harvard guy, kind of drinking his tea in the afternoon, David, I'd like to know who it was. But I threw myself into that job, and I loved it. I was good at it. I would go to back in the day, the Jones and Laughlin South Side Steelworks. There was a bar. The union local president, John DeFazio, was one of my early sources. And I would go to that bar and say, "I'll buy any steelworker in this place a drink if they'll talk to the Wall Street Journal." And so I had a chance to get out of my skin, get out of the wonderful but encumbering education that I'd had, and learn how to talk to people who were different from me, and learned how to get them to tell me news. Pittsburgh also is central in my life because I met my wife here. We've now been married almost 45 years, and I said a few minutes ago to somebody that for this reason I'll always think of Pittsburgh as the sexiest place on the planet. And if Eve was here, well, If you met Eve, you know that I'm not really exaggerating there. I threw myself into this job that I loved, and what I learned was, as I said a moment ago, it's about getting out of yourself. It's about getting out of your assumptions and preconceptions. It's about challenging yourself and your readers with new information. It's about getting it right. I mean, I made mistakes early in my career that I remember one mistake I made. I couldn't sleep 2 nights. I thought I was going to be fired for sure. I thought we were going to get a huge lawsuit. Luckily, we escaped it, but it just terrified me, and it changed me forever as a journalist. I never want to be in that situation again. But we learned the basics of what people these days call mainstream media, mainstream journalism. It's often spoken in a kind of derisory way. But the idea was to be balanced, to report both sides of a story as accurately as we could, to give readers the information to make up their own minds, not make up their minds for them. And that was the heyday of the news business in America in terms of our profitability, in terms of public trust. I don't have to tell you that this is a different time. My newspaper has run into financial trouble, even though we're owned by the second richest man in the galaxy, Jeff Bezos, who's been, in my book, a wonderful owner. But we and other people in the news business are having trouble in a world where people don't want their biases challenged. And that's our biggest problem, is that the way that the news business evolved, this idea that you had, sort of elite news organizations, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek, the Wall Street Journal, that would curate information, this universe of information. They'd figure out what really mattered, and then they'd share that with you, and they'd cover it carefully and get it right. People decided they didn't want that. They wanted to do their own curation. Pull their news sources from Facebook or from crazy social media sources of other kinds. And so that's been a difficult period for us. And in a subscriber world, in a click-driven world, people treat their news sources almost like a club. And they want their club to tell them that the people they like are really good, even better than they thought. And the people they don't like are even worse than they thought. And here's the evidence. That you will never make a mistake in today's cable news environment in reinforcing people's existing biases and prejudices. I'm sorry to say that. But that's our biggest problem. That's the thing I try most to fight against. And it's especially acute now when our country is so polarized, and we have a very polarizing president. Whatever you think about him, that's part of what he's trying to do. So it's a challenge to try to be a journalist with the rules that I grew up learning here in Pittsburgh, and that I want to hold on to. If I felt I couldn't do that kind of work, I wouldn't really want to be a journalist anymore. I'm not really interested in throwing red meat to the lions. So I thought in this opening conversation, then Farnham and I are going to talk about all kinds of things. I just would tell you about how I spent this first 10 days of Trump's presidency trying to follow my instincts as a columnist, but I'm really a reporter. I'm not an opinions guy. And I'd welcome comments if we have questions and answers, or maybe Farnham can ask whether you think this is sensible or not. So I spent last week in Davos at this sort of appalling but still useful gathering. Farnham was there, and we were at the World Economic Forum, and just get puffed up even saying it. The reality was that all anybody really wanted to talk about in Davos was Donald Trump, who was inaugurated as the week began, and the week closed with Trump addressing on Thursday this World Economic Forum audience. You may have seen it on TV, and so the first column that I wrote about his presidency, once he was in office, was an account of this extraordinary delivery before the World Economic Forum. And if you saw pictures, there was something kind of Star Wars, the kind of imperial address, this huge screen in the World Economic Forum Center, and underneath him were five people. Political and economic giants normally, but they looked tiny under this huge portrait of Trump. And they sounded pretty tiny too, to be honest, in their questions. They asked the meekest, mildest questions, tell me just how wonderful your policies are going to be, Mr. President. One person, the head of the Bank of America, asked it wasn't, it was a lot of nice kitty in it, but it was also slightly direct. And Trump jumped on him and said, "Your bank discriminates against conservatives." I have no idea what happened to his Bank of America stock price, but I have a feeling it went down. So I try to describe this, and this sense of strategic deference was the phrase somebody used with me, and that's what it felt like. But I also said that, and I believe this, that one of the most interesting things about Trump is that he ran on a platform that there are too many wars in the world and they're too dangerous, and he's going to try to end them. And it's easy to discount that, but he seems to be serious about it in a way that I, at least, want to take seriously as a journalist. So, he said he wants to end the Ukraine war as soon as he can. I've been to Ukraine 5 times since the war started. I have seen how painful that war is. The last time I was there in October, I wrote that Ukraine is bleeding out. The level of death and destruction. I visited hospitals to see a lot of the people who suffered most grievously from this war, and hear from them what it is. Talk to a lot of soldiers on that trip, and so the idea that we've had that we'll stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. That was the phrase that the Biden administration used, and I have written about it positively. That's really not realistic, because as long as it takes, there's just not going to be enough Ukraine left fighting this much bigger country. So, I think the idea of trying to bring an honorable settlement to this war that doesn't reward Putin's invasion is a good thing. And so when President Trump speaks about it, I wrote that this was a positive surprise, in part because my biggest fear has been that he would offer a conciliatory settlement that rewarded Putin's invasion. He's actually gone off in a different direction. He's threatened sanctions already. He had this sort of ridiculous tough guy movie line, you can do it the hard way or you can do it the easy way. I don't know if you read his social media post. But he seems to be serious in saying it's not just going to be a rollover. And I'm all for that. He said something else that surprised me in this speech, which was that he had been talking during his first term with both Russia and China about significant reductions in nuclear weapons. And it turns out that among all the other things about Trump, he has actually been quite a passionate opponent of nuclear weapons for many years. So there again, I don't want to let the expectations of my readers that you're never going to say something nice about Donald Trump prevent me from saying those two things I think are good. So I did say those as directly as I could. Second of the 4 columns I wrote in the last 4 or 5 days was about his remarks Saturday on Air Force One, sort of glibly talking about the forced relocation of Palestinians from Gaza. I've been in Gaza once since the war began, and it is like the photographs that you've seen. It looks like Berlin did as World War II was ending. It's hard. On my visit just south of Gaza City, I couldn't see a building that hadn't been damaged or destroyed, and that was many months ago. And so, the level of destruction is horrible. And the idea that you just say, sorry, this place is, Trump said, it looks like a demolition zone. Let's get everybody out of here. Was offensive to leaders in the Middle East across the board, and also bothered me. So I wrote a column that said, this is his first big blunder, and here's why. I just talked, using sources that I have, about his conversation with King Abdullah of Jordan and how he'd sort of dropped this and then couldn't resist talking about it on Air Force One. So that was a second bite. We've all been watching the chaos of the edicts and orders and freezes that affect just about every part of the federal government's business. But a special concern of mine is the effect on public health. I have a family member who was a young professor at one of the great medical schools. So I tried to report by talking to a number of doctors and young researchers and professors exactly what this means. What's different in your life today for these orders? I mean, I think in this last week we felt like we're facing this fire hose of edicts, and it needs to feel tangible and immediate. So I did try to report that this person who was about to apply for an NIH grant to do this thing that will, potentially save thousands of lives, has to stop because the NIH isn't going to listen. This meeting on hepatitis that was scheduled for San Francisco in March won't have anybody from the FDA or the NIH because they're not allowed to travel. This meeting on HIV probably will be canceled for similar reasons. The CDC's essential weekly publication on morbidity and mortality didn't publish this last issue because of the chaos. Is it going to start up again? Is the data series going to be corrupted? Those kinds of specific real-world effects. And then I wrote a column this morning about Tulsi Gabbard, whose hearing was today, appeared last night, saying another thing that I think is important. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories about her and Russia and Syria and all this, but you don't really need to get into conspiracy territory to know that she's not an appropriate choice to oversee all of the nation's intelligence agencies. She lacks the competence in terms of experience. That I wrote in the piece, Senator Warner said this morning, the law that created that position specifically says that the person who's chosen as Director of National Intelligence should have special expertise in these areas. Whatever you'd say about her, like her, don't like her, she does not have that kind of special expertise. There are reasons why her credibility, because she's been back and forth on so many issues that affect the intelligence community, is open to question. And finally, the essential issue for any government official, and I say this thinking of my own father, who's now 104, but served, he's probably the oldest living Kennedy presidential appointee, certainly in the Defense Department. But his whole career as a public servant was about judgment. It was about exercising good judgment. And I'm sorry, but this nominee and others simply didn't meet that test. So that's. When I was a young war correspondent, I said to myself, I was going to try to cover, this was the Civil War in Lebanon, first conflict that I covered. I was going to cover it village by village. I was going to try to break down this big, hard to digest story and see it in small pieces so that I could understand it and hopefully my readers could understand it. And that's what I'm trying to do, as I explained in covering this president. I hope that's what we'll all try to do It's, there's an attempt to overwhelm us with so many orders, edicts, but I hope we'll find a way to digest this. So, Farnham, let's talk up on stage. Thank you so much for coming and listening to what I had to say.
Well, David, thank you again for being here. Thank you for coming back. And next time, bring your wife, and we'll have her go through all the campus labs and see the amazing things that are going on at CMU. By the way, we'll get you a bunch of those buttons so you can hand them.
I'm going to hand them out. Everybody loves robots.
So we'll do that. Can we turn on the lights just a little bit more? Could we do that? Someone handle that. Thank you. David, I want to start with the U.S. presidential election. Back then, we had no idea, if we think back about a year ago or so, we had no idea that President Trump would do better in every critical swing state. He would do, in 2024 compared to 2020, he would do better just about in every county and so many different demographic groups. It was quite astonishing how much better President Trump did in 2024 versus 2020. In September of 2023, more than a year before the election, you wrote an op-ed, and in that op-ed, which was somewhat controversial at the time, you suggested that President Biden should bow out and not run. Of course, it took another 9-10 months before that actually happened. And it may have been a couple of weeks after when I saw you at this event in last July. I want to ask you, what led you to write that article? What prompted it? And what kind of reaction you got? And then I want to come back and talk about what did the Democrats actually get wrong in this last election?
So that column exploded. I don't know if people remember it, but the White House, and I was told the president and even more the First Lady were furious. So where did it come from? In the summer of 2023, I remember talking with you, Farnham, about President Biden's age. I remember going to a series of dinner parties with prominent Democrats. One had a member of his cabinet, and that was the dominant subject of conversation. He's really up for another term. Through that summer, I couldn't go anywhere but that wasn't a topic of conversation. And in August, a poll came out from the Associated Press that showed that, I believe the number was 75% of all Americans and 67% of Democrats felt that Joe Biden was too old to serve another full term. It was an overwhelming public response. And I thought to myself, how can it be that there's no public discussion of something that 75% of the country believes? Something's wrong here. So, I am not a big soapbox guy, but I wrote this pretty emphatically, just presenting the evidence and asking whether Joe Biden, who was, then and now his greatest defender, was disserving the person she loved by, encouraging him to stay in the race. I think I noted in that column that Lady Bird Johnson talked in detail with Lyndon Johnson about whether he should run again in the many months before he decided to withdraw from the race, being a supportive partner. So as I look back, there's this idea that there was some kind of White House conspiracy to suppress the fact of Joe Biden's advancing age. And I think that's ridiculous. I mean,
everybody could see it. It wasn't a, I mean, it wasn't a conspiracy. It was on TV. Everybody knew it. 75% of the country knew it. People in the White House knew it. The problem was different. It was twofold. I have done some reporting. I haven't published it yet, but I found a senior White House official who did, in fact, before the president made his decision in April 2023 to run again, go to the very top level below the president and say, I just don't think he's up to another 4 years. And this person was told, he's running. So don't even just drop it. Why? Why was that? And the answer is simple, and I'll close it with this. Joe Biden believed that he was the only person who could defeat Donald Trump. He'd done it in 2020. He'd basically done it in the midterms in 2022, where Democrats did much better than anybody thought. And he I think part of this is he felt that his vice president, the numbers showed she was even less popular than he was, that she couldn't get it done. So he stayed in. And as it turns out, that was a tragic decision. That's going to be the second line of his obituary. The reason it was so difficult for me to write this article back in September 2023 was, I basically thought Biden's policies were good, were sensible. So it was not easy to make this critical comment. He took it very personally. I later heard from him directly, personally. So, that's how it came to be, Farnham, and I think people in the news media, so when I wrote that column, I thought there'd be a lot of other people kind of joining the conversation. Let's have a conversation. Does this make any sense? Is this the right thing for the country? And instead, the faucets were turned off and there was no discussion. And a lot of big news organizations began writing pieces about, no, it was Trump who was too old. He's the guy who's senile. And so there was no discussion of this issue. And I think we all can see the consequences. Biden, was a wonderful person and in many ways was a good president. But he will be, it will be said that he opened the door to Donald Trump's return. With what we see now it's very consequential that he's now our president.
Thank you for that response. So, reflecting on the election, what did the Democrats get wrong? I'm going to read you something from Wall Street Journal.
Okay.
And it was a couple of days after the election. It said, compared with his performance in 2020, Donald Trump gained ground in counties with the highest share of young voters, as well as parts of the country with the most non-white voters. Trump's performance in suburban counties bounced back from 2020 presidential contest, and he further strengthened his support among white voters without college degrees. So what did the Democrats get wrong? If you think about the last...
So in simple terms, he did better running against Kamala Harris than he had running against Joe Biden. And Biden beat him, and Harris didn't, and he did better in all these key swing states, as he often says. The morning after the election, trying to think this through, I looked, as we do in the news business, at the exit polls, which were showing all these significant incremental gains by Trump. But the thing that struck me, the size of his overall victory was not that large. We're a divided country, and he won, by a bigger margin certainly than we anticipated. But the overwhelming thing to me in the exit polls was that I think the number is 73%. Mm-hmm. Of those polled said they were dissatisfied with the status quo. And that's where we are as a country. When Trump says, I have a mandate for change, that's not entirely wrong. That comes out of the exit polls and what we know about where the country is. Democrats and Republicans alike just aren't happy with where the country is. There's this feeling we need to change. And he's speaking to that. So I think what the Democrats And Kamala Harris tried to be a talk about change, and she certainly represents a younger, more diverse picture of America. But I don't think the Democrats so often seem the party that says you can't change it, and on some subjects you can't talk about it. And Trump is the guy who'll say anything, and people like that. People don't like to feel that they're being told what not to say.
Let me just follow up and ask a follow-up question. That if you had a crystal ball and you look down the road for the next couple of years, what do you think are some of the emerging issues? You partially alluded to this. Do you foresee shaping American politics and the global landscape that we're in?
So I think that the first question in the world, the areas that I cover, Trump has talked about ending an incredible, he called it a killing field the other day. It is. The Ukraine war is a bloodbath. And he has said he's going to end it. And that's a really important objective. And as I say, if he can do it in a way that doesn't reward the aggressor, I'm all for it. But that matters a lot. Where Russia is headed in the aftermath of this catastrophic mistake by Putin. I'll just remind people, Russia, I quoted the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, in my last visit with him at the end of December, saying, Russia has now lost, dead and wounded, 700,000, more than 700,000 people in the 3 years of this war. That is 10 times the number they lost in the 10 years of the Afghanistan war, which, as we know, broke the back of the Soviet Union. So, I mean, it's a devastating experience for Russia. And I'm one of those people who thinks that Russia, under the surface, is weaker than it seems. So what's going to happen? Let's imagine there's a peace settlement, and this is a Russia in decline that's, suffering this grievous wound. What happens? Is it enraged at the West, and we face a decade or more of continued strife in different ways? Does it fragment? Many Ukrainian friends hope it'll break apart. Trump has talked, interestingly, about enlisting China as a co-guarantor of a peace agreement for Ukraine. Well, that's interesting. I worry about a lot of things about China, but the idea that this superpower could work with us to guarantee a settlement, she is the only person Putin would really listen to, probably. So that's an interesting idea, and it raised the larger question where we're going with China. And then, last, Farnham, we are in a period of such convulsive change, deliberately instigated by Trump across the board. How are we going to get through that? Are our legal institutions, many of these things have been described as blatantly unconstitutional, blatantly illegal. Is our legal system strong enough to find what's legal and what isn't? He is president. He got both houses of Congress, but that doesn't mean you can do illegal, unconstitutional things. So those are the areas I think would be top of my list.
You mentioned that you and I were both in Davos at the World Economic Forum. I know you were on a couple of panels, and you moderated a panel on the conflict in the Middle East. So what did you hear talking to various world leaders and thought leaders and technologies? What did you hear about their perception of our presidential election and the results, and also about the impact of it on U.S.'s reputation and leadership on the global stage? You shared your thoughts about, President Trump's remarks at the event on that Thursday afternoon, but what were you hearing from others as you talked to people?
So I don't know, contradict me if you heard something different. I heard generally a sense of accommodation. I said strategic deference earlier toward Trump's election. This is a gathering mostly of business people.
Sure.
And I wrote in my summary this is a sort of a momentum trade. I mean, it's obvious that Trump's got the momentum, you know, and you're going to ride this one up for a while. The world's betting on American power, and the world also is afraid. They're afraid of Trump. You know, he's prepared to take retaliatory steps against people who don't do what he wants. But there's a deeper fear that I find, especially among Europeans, so that they've got this very aggressive Putin to their east. They've got a increasingly disinterested America to their west, you know, America that talks about its own interests quite ruthlessly. And then Europe itself, I've never seen Europe politically weaker. In France, in Germany, you just don't know what's coming. I mean, a consistent theme that I heard was anxiety about the European economy. And people said what used to be a kind of, you know, right-wing line, but I heard it again and again from liberal Europeans. You know, we are overregulated, overtaxed, and politically disoriented. It takes Brussels forever to make decisions, and you know, we look at you and you know, you're racing ahead. We look at the Chinese and they're racing ahead, and we're sort of anchored. So those were the big themes I heard.
I actually agree with your assessment, because some of the conversations that I had, I think the best way to characterize it is, as you said, it's anxiety. Clearly, Western Europe, other democracies look to U.S. as a strong ally. And not knowing what to expect, I think, is creating a lot of anxiety, a lot of churn. I was in Europe and in Europe 3 times over the last just 2-3 months, before the election and then after the election. I noticed there was quite a bit of essentially anxiousness about the election, how it would turn out. And then since the election, I've been there twice, including the time in Davos with you. I think it was just, there's general anxiety about what to expect from the United States. At the same time, you're absolutely right. A number of people commented how strong the US economy is, in spite of what we hear from our elected officials, that we're envy of the rest of the world when it comes to our economy, and how we are continuing to lead the world on so many fronts. And there's a level of, I would say, envy, respect, and at the same time, you're absolutely right. With respect to President Trump, I was in Davos after President Trump was elected the first time, and I agree with you that there was this level of accommodation, respect, and understanding that this is real, and Europe had to play it the right way. That was sort of my impression from the business leaders and some of the folks that I talked to.
I agree. I think the world, it's good for people to take American power seriously. You just don't want American power to be abused.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts about China before I move on to another topic? By the way, folks, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and please follow the instructions that you see on the screen, and we're going to try to get to a handful of questions this afternoon. David, what do you think of China?
So, I think China is struggling, not to the extent that Europe is, but the Chinese, ever expanding, inevitable superpower that would surpass the U.S. That China, I think, is in the past. China will still be formidable. This last week's DeepSeek shock, my gosh, Chinese AI maybe as good as even better than our best AI, is a reminder of how creative and dynamic a country this is. People who serve in government have tell me often, if you could see what I see in terms of the kind of classified details about Chinese power and the development of weapons and systems, you'd be really scared. So, I take that seriously, and I just say one more thing about Trump vis-a-vis China. During his first term, I asked one of his top China advisors about his policies, and he said, I'll sum up for you Donald Trump's policy in one sentence. Xi Jinping is my friend. And it's a very Trumpian thing. It's like it's personal, two big guys, we'll figure it out. He's repeated that line. He in his speech at Davos, he said the same thing. I like the guy, I've known him well, we're really good friends. There are ways in which that's good. I want our presidents to have good relations with the leaders of other superpowers. There are ways in which it's not good. I mean, the Chinese really, there is a way that you may end up coddling a very dangerous and arbitrary dictator. So, what I think about China is for the rest of my life, but I'm old, for the rest of my children's lives, grandchildren's lives, China is going to be the dominant power in the world, and we better find a way. A war between the United States and China would be catastrophic. It'd be like a catastrophe on the level that the world, even thinking of World War II and World War I, hasn't seen. So it's profoundly in our interest to be strong enough to deter that.
I want to pivot and talk a little bit about Pittsburgh. You have written about your love about Pittsburgh. You just shared some personal stories about Pittsburgh and how you met your wife. You've written about it beautifully, and also, fast forward to today, Pittsburgh is a very different city from the time that you were living here. In fact, I'm going to read something that you wrote, and when you were asked about the period in our region's history, you said that, and I quote, "Even the suggestion that there was another life for Pittsburgh beyond steel seems ridiculous." Well, David, we've come a long way. This is a pretty scrappy, you asked me earlier today, and I mentioned to you that I've lived here now 10 years, coming up 11 years, and you kind of fall in love with this city. There's something unique about it, and I know there are a bunch of long-term Pittsburghers who are sitting here. So from where you sit now, several decades later, what is so special about this place? And what are some of the lessons that you think we've learned as a nation that could be sort of benefit the rest of the country?
So to me, Pittsburgh's about resilience. I was a reporter here when the great decline of the steel industry was beginning. And I was an aggressive young reporter, and I wrote a lot of stories about how uncompetitive the U.S. steel industry had become. The union was very strong, wages were very high, our companies got less and less competitive, and weirdly our antitrust laws made the situation worse. The consent decree in the U.S. Steel monopolization case basically meant that if any of the 9 basic steel producers were driven out of business by an efficient U.S. or Bethlehem Steel that learned how to make steel a lot cheaper, it would be a prima facie case of monopolization. So there was no incentive. There was a legal disincentive to innovate. And the Japanese were innovating. They built their steel industry from scratch. And I wrote a lot of pieces saying that the talk about unfair Japanese competition and dumped steel was hooey. It just wasn't true. They were making it cheaper and more efficiently because they had new mills. They were really pioneering new technologies. So, Pittsburgh went down, and many of you lived it. And when I drive through McKeesport, as I've written, they look like a place that was defeated in war. It's painful. I loved going to your Mill 19 today to see what you can build on, what was an old abandoned rolling mill. So when I say resilience, it turned out that Pittsburgh had these incredible resources. CMU and UPMC at the top of the list that were incredible technology and job generators. And people in this part of the country, but really this is true about America as a whole, were resourceful enough to kind of make new dynamic industries. And when I wrote it, I don't know if it's what you're quoting from, but I did a little study to see what had happened to per capita income, real income, adjusted for inflation, in the Pittsburgh SMSA compared to the good old days when the steel industry was booming, and now when supposedly, Pittsburgh was a walking skeleton. And it won't surprise you that per capita real income is significantly higher now than it was. So that's a picture of a region that learned how to adapt. And it's one of the things that makes me angry when I listen to Trump talking about kind of this ruined America and everything, we're a laughing stock and we can't do anything. I mean, that's not the country that I live in. I don't know what he's talking about. And Pittsburgh, I know a lot of folks here voted for him. This Rust Belt America is in a sense the heart of the Trump phenomenon, but this sort of running down our incredible ability to survive, evolve, adapt, I think is a terrible mistake. Makes me angry.
I would just add to your comments that what's been remarkable to see during the time that I've been in Pittsburgh is this extraordinary alignment of public, private, and civic leaders, including our foundation community. It is just quite amazing. And when people ask me what's sort of my assessment of it, and I didn't live here in the 70s and 80s, but it's very clear that when you have no other options and a third of the population left the area, really you don't play games anymore. You have to have the conviction, as you said, the resiliency to pick up and just move on. And I really do believe that the public sector, the private sector, our foundation community, and the civic leaders coming together was really at the heart of what has happened to Pittsburgh. And by the way, it continues to the state, which I think is a great lesson.
Just a shout out for you and this audience. I mean, CMU is a national treasure. And it just keeps going up in the league tables. It was a soccer team; it'd be in the Premier League. Having started in the 4th division. I mean, it's not the 4th division, but so I was hearing from one of your people today about the maybe you were telling me about just how selective CMU is, just how hard it is to get in. It was like Stanford, MIT, I don't know, Harvard, someplace, and Carnegie Mellon, and it's fantastic. And as I say, my wife has a doctorate in computer science. She's the idea of being at CMU, is for her a dream. So good on you. Good on you.
Well, we're just going to have her back, definitely. Bethany, are we ready to take a couple of questions from the audience?
We are.
Go
We're
for it.
so ready. We have about 70 questions, David.
Whoa. Whoa.
I want to start with one that I think is just going to be fantastic for you. In the fictional world where you could ask President Trump or his team anything and they couldn't lie, what would you ask them?
Whoa. What would I ask him? I'd ask him whether he really understands when his policies are hurting the ordinary Americans he talks about helping. I mean, I'd sometimes think he doesn't get that, and that's sort of a dopey question. To be honest, I can't really imagine interviewing him. But I'd like to, the empathy issue. Does he really see and feel the experience and suffering of others? When he talks about the Ukraine war, it's an unusual example. He speaks with passion. He talks about looking at the photographs of the dead and wounded, and you can just hear something real. So, yeah.
Next question. Recently, the Supreme Court's TikTok decision prioritized national security concerns over freedom of speech. As a journalist, what do you think of that?
So, I always want to speak up for freedom of speech. That's what I do. TikTok is a very unusual example. It is incredibly powerful. It is addictive. It is owned by a foreign government that, in many ways, appears to wish us ill. So there's something about protecting ourselves that I think should lead us to take TikTok seriously. The idea of having such a powerful instrument of social, I don't want to say control, but social direction in the hands of a potential adversary is worrying. I don't think being an advocate of free speech doesn't mean that anybody should be allowed to own the most powerful instrument of communication. And saying ByteDance can't own this on behalf of the Chinese government doesn't mean you're denying people's right to free speech. They're different.
Let's take one more.
Let's end on a slightly positive note. Given how polarized our politics seem to be, what issues would you expect to see collaboration on across the aisle in the next few years?
Whoever asked that question, thank you.
So I think there's going to be a lot of collaboration. I think many Democrats are trying to signal that. I'm going to meet tomorrow with, I'll just say him, name him, because he's, I think it's going to be on the record, Senator Coons, Chris Coons, who's one of my favorite members of the Senate, who consistently tries to work across the aisle. And he's going to talk about the ways in which he's working for bipartisanship. He's now running a key part of the Senate Appropriations Committee with Senator McConnell, and all the things they want to do that are going to be good for the country. So, I think once things settle down, I don't know what I think about the Secretary of Defense, but the number 2 that they picked is really good. Steve Feinberg's first rate. Elon Musk sometimes, drives me nuts, but he is an absolutely brilliant engineer. So many of our tech geniuses have made digits. He makes cars. He makes rockets. He makes physical things, and he has a mechanical engineer's sense of. I've heard him speak, and he's most compelling when he talks about building stuff, and how many units it would take, and how the kind of logistics of how you'd actually get to Mars and sustain it, and how many rockets you have to launch every week, and how many. So the fact that he is this most brilliant technology entrepreneurs of our time are all trying to help Trump make our country more efficient. How can you not like that? So I just don't want, when I think of what I heard about our public health system, and the programs that could save lives that are frozen, and what I hear from young doctors who just are despairing about their careers, that can't coexist with this other stuff that's positive. Somehow, somebody said to me once, David, that's a good way to end it. Your biggest failing as a journalist is you're too optimistic. Journalists are supposed to be, famously, they smell the flowers and they look for the funeral. So, I'll just close by saying, as an optimistic person, my optimism is certainly enhanced by coming to Carnegie Mellon and seeing all the things that your students, your faculty are doing. Thank you, Farnham.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I know we're slightly over our allocated time, but if you permit me, I want to wrap up with a couple of really quick questions. One has to do with disinformation and misinformation, and the impact of this on our political discourse, and impact of that more specifically on media and on journalism. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role of disinformation in shaping public knowledge and public perception? And also, how is it impacting your industry?
Well, to be blunt, we live in an increasingly polluted information environment. So much of what comes at people through social media channels is false, or you have no idea whether it's true or false. It's corrupted. In the part of journalism that I grew up in, I worked for the Wall Street Journal for 10 years. It was a business newspaper. People who had enormous amounts of money at risk needed reliable information. They couldn't live with, short sellers used to, when you answered the phone at the Wall Street Journal, you had to be damn sure that you weren't talking to a short seller who was feeding you information which, while true, was poisoned by the desire to drive down the stock price of a particular company. You had to be very careful. So we made sure that the information stream was free of disinformation. I'm trying to get away from the traditional, the current description of this, just to think about short sellers. Think about all the people who've got crazy revenge scenarios who come to reporters. Everybody who comes to a reporter comes with axe behind their back. So you have to be aware of that. So again, expressing my hope, simply for reasons of survival, people are going to eventually say, I cannot drink from this polluted stream of information anymore. It's going to kill me. Just as a business person would say, it's got to be reliable. Citizens will say that. And that, that's the answer to misinformation, disinformation, Farnham, is people insisting and paying money for pure, reliably filtered, healthy information stream. But if you don't, you'll get what you deserve. You'll get what you pay for. If people pay for good information, they'll get more of it. If they pay for, what's increasingly out there, they'll get more of that. It's on readers. It's on consumers of information because they'll dictate the market.
Freedom of press is so foundational to our democracy. Are you optimistic about the future of your profession?
For the reason that I just said, in the long run, yes, because I think this current situation is intolerable. The dream that we had, you and I are roughly contemporaries, that the internet, the digital world would lead to a new era of freedom, the dissemination of information everywhere would be liberating. It turned out it didn't work that way. And the paradox is that the internet world ends up creating greater social control in repressive countries and greater social chaos in free countries. That's just the way it's worked out. And again, I think for reasons of survival, people will rebel against that, and I'm optimistic. If you ask me, would I tell my children to go into the news business, the answer is, if you love it the way that I did. As I said, I fell in love. That was my experience of being a journalist. This was the only thing I wanted to do. And in my 30s, I kept saying, I wonder if it's too late to go to law school, And then it was too late to go to law school. I was stuck. So, but if you really love it, the future is boundless and bright.
I neglected to mention that in addition to being an accomplished journalist, David is also a best-selling fiction writer. He's written 12 books.
12 novels.
12 novels. And his latest novel, Phantom Orbit, we were talking about it. It's about a leak to the CIA, and this leak reveals that a covert Russia-China space satellite technology that could potentially disrupt America's reliance on GPS. I have to tell you, watching David today with some of our faculty and talking to some of our graduate students in a couple of the demos, you could see, and I did not know that his wife is a computer scientist. Now everything makes sense. you could see that he has a passion for technology and has a passion for science. Before I get to my last question, how do you get your ideas?
So I have written 12 novels, and with I wrote a lot about the Middle East, which I covered, and they were kind of. One of them was made into a big, fancy Hollywood movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio. I want to give that a little plug, called Body of Lies. But a lot of them were about this world of intrigue with pretty traditional themes and characters. And then in 2012 or so, it seemed obvious to me that the world of intelligence, the world of the spy novel, was moving from these traditional themes to zeros and ones, to the digital world. That, in the new world, it was more useful to recruit the systems administrator for an intelligence agency than the director. And that information operations, technology secrets, that was the heart of intelligence. So I've now written 4 novels in a row about that. The first one I started in 2012-13. It's called The Director, and it was about somebody young computer scientist working for the CIA and its information operations division, who begins leaking information to the Russians. I thought it was a pretty interesting plot. And then along comes Edward Snowden. And real life was so much more interesting than my book. I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I frantically rewrote it, and I'd love to tell this story. So I gave this rewritten version to my wife Eve, who's my first reader, and I want your honest opinion. When we say that, we always mean I want you, an honest person, to tell me this is really good. So she said, bless her heart, it's not there yet. And I knew that was true. So the publisher was screaming at me. I was way past the deadline, so I took one more. I had this insane week of just frantically tearing it up, and you can do that with a computer. You can cut and paste to your heart's content, and turned it into a good book, or a better book. Since then I've written a novel called The Quantum Spy, about the U.S.-Chinese competition to develop quantum computing. I wrote a book called The Paladin, whose hero is from McKeesport, who's carrying all that burden of the broken Rust Belt world on his shoulders. And it's about deep fakes and AI and how they're changing the landscape of intelligence. And then this most recent book is about space weapons. With each of these recent books, I've tried to think 2 years from now, when the book comes out, what are people going to be talking about? Try to anticipate what's next. And I made a couple lucky guesses, but so space weapons really are the decisive military change. The Russians, I don't know how much attention people paid to this, but Jake Sullivan, our former national security advisor, said that the Russians had launched something we called Sputnik S, which is a satellite capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. We have warned the Russians that if they put a nuclear weapon on it, the expectation was that they might launch the nuclear-capable version by the end of the year. If they didn't, that we would consider that a fundamental threat to our national security, and we might shoot it down, even on the launch pad. So why is it so dangerous? A nuclear weapon exploding in low Earth orbit is not the explosion itself and the debris, because that would, fall to Earth. It's the radiation belt that would basically disable every satellite in low Earth orbit. And I'm sure this audience knows Elon Musk has 3,000, more than that, 3,500 satellites in low Earth orbit for Starlink. And the number, so much of, these are the telegraph poles on which our whole world depends. So anyway, so I decided I'd write a novel about that. This is, it's so much fun if you're a journalist and you're kind of a prisoner of fact to have an excuse to just make it up, and that's what I do.
Well, on that note, I want to end with our final question. Candidly, I can sit here and talk to David for the next 2 hours, and I know every one of you would sit here and want to listen to David. David, one final question for you. We have a lot of audience. By the way, we're live streaming this, and I know there are students that are in the audience and are also watching this. As you think about your career, as you think about your own journey, many of our students who are in the range of, say, 18 to 25-year-olds are going to start their journey, their careers. What are like one or two pieces of advice you have for them?
Well, this is like the graduation speech.
Go for it. I'll invite you back for commencement.
Just taking the lessons of my own life, there are two that I'll note. The first is one I've referred to repeatedly, which is to do something that you really love. And I was lucky enough to find that here in Pittsburgh, and I knew what I was good at. And then from that point on, once you've found that, and I think people should not be in a rush. Often you don't find that until you're 30, more than that. Once you find it, then put your foot on the gas and just go as hard and fast and far as you can. The second lesson is unusual, I think. So in 1987, when I was 37 years old, I published my first novel called Agents of Innocence. It was about how the CIA had recruited and run Yasser Arafat's chief of intelligence as an American agent for 10 years, and how he had then been killed by the Israelis. It was an incredibly complicated, we talk about the gray area of spy novels. It had quite an impact because basically everything in it was true. I had reported this story as a journalist in Beirut. I was in the American embassy on a particular day in April 1983. I left the embassy at 12:30, just after 1 o'clock. Boom! The embassy was destroyed by a car bomb. You may remember the images of that. And the case officer who'd run this amazing operation, think about it. Yasser Arafat's chief of intelligence was an American spy? Are you kidding me? So he was killed, along with every member of the CIA station. So that's how I became a novelist. And the book ended up being a big hit once people, kind of got over the shock and realized this was probably all true. So I had a choice. It seemed like a fork in the road. I had this career as a journalist, and it was really going well then. And then I had this other career that was just starting as a novelist. And I thought, David, you really have got to make a choice. You can't do both. You got to either, try to be the best novelist you can or be the best. And I just couldn't make up my mind. I couldn't bear the thought of giving up either one. I was afraid that I could never make enough money as a novelist to support. I had 3 children then. So I didn't choose. I just ended up doing them both, and probably, never did either as well as I might have. But so that's the second lesson. Sometimes in life, when you think you have to make a choice, the right answer is not to make a choice. To find a way to do, the many things that you love. So find the thing you love. If there end up being more than one, well, don't kill off, one just because you think you have to be monopolar. So those are my 2 lessons.
Well, with that, David, thank you for spending the day with us. Thanks for this great conversation. Let me extend an open invitation to you and Eve to come back and to spend a couple of days with us again with our campus community. Thank you again for being with us. Thank you. Thanks. Well done. Well done.